Welcome to the show your parents, the PTA, and the asleep don't want you to hear. The Helios blog. Today, Jordan Peterson discusses PSYOPS, foreign PSYOPS in the United States. This should be crazy.
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
We kind of skipped over something that, in a way, or we haven't developed it enough yet, that's really that's a claim that's very radical. I mean, I don't think anybody who's watching or listening is going to be shocked by the fact that the social media algorithms are prioritizing outrage to capture attention and that there's economic utility in that. But, you know, you're making a claim that's on the face of it in the realm of conspiracy theory, you know,
Yes.
and that is that there are foreign PSYOP operations that are dementing the political landscape, and that's a massive ploy, that it's conscious, that it's led by Iran, China, and Russia, let's say. And so maybe we can, let's
break that down.
Yeah, let's do
Okay.
that. And because
So-
I would really like to see you prove that.
So the measurements, the first thing I should say is that when you're measuring how a culture thinks and moves, it's incredibly complicated. And so obviously, right, you can push pull. I mean, you talked a lot about this early in our methodology for outreach to, one, not make things worse. And two, I remember we showed you a poll from anti-Semitism in the 30s.
My instinct is con man, but let's see.
And it said, do you think Jews are clannish? Do you think Jews do this in business? And you looked up and you said, I'm pretty sure if people weren't anti-Semitic before taking the survey, they would be afterwards.
Right, absolutely.
How
how you form questions inform, right? And they set the stage for dialogue. And the idea that a question can be neutral, I mean, we're veering into postmodern territory here, but
we do have that when we get to the agreement piece
yeah,
as well, that
Yeah.
how you phrase things matter. So
Yeah.
the first thing is we have an approach that is based on genuine curiosity for the longest term good. We do. We're not like sort of, that's what we're in it for. And so we make inquiries. There's a bunch of different things you have to study, and then we try and fill in all the missing pieces as best we can. But I think that it's overwhelmingly compelling what the case is. But we take polls. Gretchen does stuff for some people aren't as articulate in polling when we do the focus group, aside from the polling, that she has them bring up and do visual representations of how they're thinking. There's a bunch of means of ingress that we try to have from all different sides of the culture. Small focus groups, running stuff by you, running stuff by progressives, running stuff by leaders, and people on the street. And so it's a combination of polls, but I want to highlight a few things or approaches. So we did this TikTok study about foreign PSYOPs, and we found that on TikTok, women between the age of 18 and 34 have an unfavorability, a view of America's unfavorability that is 52 points up above the norm.
No way. What? TikTok has been brainwashing girls to hate the United States, huh?
So think about what an extraordinary outlier that is for one demographic group, right? Opinions about Israel and Jews follow, as they often do, right? So, you know, little Satan, big Satan, they're tied together in this sort of obsessive focus of deteriorating that particular value set, an American value set. And so we were wondering why that was.
yeah. So let's just reiterate that a minute, because it's a striking finding that shouldn't be glossed over. So you've identified a subset of the American population, which is very large, women between the ages of 18 and 34, so all young women, fundamentally.
Who also are opinion setters in a variety of ways that are important for the culture and how the culture.
Right. And that you've seen that their political views about the U.S. and about...
Well, here's the thing. Girls have the greatest influence on children, right? So, I mean, what more needs to be said?
About Israel, for example, given the state of the Middle East at the moment, are wildly skewed in contrast to virtually all other demographic groups in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that they primarily get their information from TikTok.
Well, that's the punchline.
Yeah,
So
okay.
when we went to go find it and find out what accounted for this, they were 2 standard deviations above the norm on getting their information from TikTok. Now, TikTok, as we know, is owned by China, and China exports very different TikTok than they import. They import broccoli and export crack. So the students there have a time limit on it. The last time I checked, it was 20 minutes a day, and all the information is educational. But they export stuff with choppier and choppier views, and
Yeah, so the point is to make the population idiots.
it'll be like, you know, girl in bikini, was Hitler good? I mean, it's vacillating constantly between all sorts of sort of junk food. And so that's an effort to, you can shorten our kids' attention spans.
Yep.
And how much of that do you think is a consequence of the relatively Wild West status of the free market of ideas in the West, and how much of it
The best way to destroy the West is through its own goodness and highest principles. If you come in through the door of free speech, that's a very valuable cudgel that you wield. If you come in through diversity, which is in one context and definition, is in fact the beauty and power of America, which is different than when Trudeau says it, because America it is, and you come in through that trap door, it gets very difficult and the arguments get complicated. People's reference points get jumbled. So it's like every protester isn't John Lewis, right? Everybody we start to get confused about which things are off limits and which things aren't.
And do you envision like cadres of Chinese communists sitting behind the scenes manipulating the algorithms to twist and dement the US? I mean, the fact that what the Chinese feed their own children and what they're broadcasting into the United States is market, but it's hard for me to understand how much of that's actually planned subversion and how much of it is inevitable consequence of the difference between the cultures at multiple levels.
A lot of it is planned subversion. I mean, Russia and China have bot farms. We can get to this too. Iran I shouldn't say Iran, I should say the Islamic regime in Iran are brilliant messengers and strategists, right? But a lot of the power for infiltrating through social media comes from China and it comes from Russia. And part of it too is, like I mentioned about Russia sending people to Paris to paint the Stars of David. A lot of it is you set a trend. You don't need to do a whole lot if you want to flip a tripwire to make a culture tear itself apart, make people doubt, everything. I mean, the efforts to turn us against each other on vaccination. I mean, I remember Russia was playing around back in early days when people were talking about childhood vaccinations, early days, and causing autism. They've been working on this for decades. So they work on a topic, they devolve it. And, we have solutions. We have consensus in America for immigration. We're going to see how much we have. Abortion. There's topic after topic that we could find reasonable consensus on. So why don't we? And the answer is, foreign operations that come in.
Blame someone else. Yeah, that's bullshit.
Domestic players who profit off, rage and polarization.
I can see that.
And a kind of de-evolution of our story.
All right, so you used the TikTok issue as a case study in foreign PSYOPS.
So let's see if it's effective. So Ukrainian support in 2022, only 7% of the Americans felt the U.S. was providing too much support. 85% of Americans supported Russian sanctions. In 2024, 31% believed that it was too much support. So that's significant. That's 4x. And this is how things are won too. It's not like a PSYOP is brilliantly executed. It's what you want is to move things 10, 20 degrees. What you want to do is shift momentum and then lean on it in different ways. And look at the difference here. 42% believe that U.S. was not providing enough support, 24%, so that dropped significantly. Now, in fairness, 2 years later in a war, people are tired, resources are tired. There's a lot of different reasons for this. However, and I also think, though, that the conviction and the basic moral underpinnings of how the war is going in Ukraine haven't changed substantially from mission creep. It seems to me that the people who are opposed to it were mostly opposed to it in concept of what the role was, rather than it's something that people are now exhausted by the expenditure. But that certainly plays a role, and some people are. But nonetheless, we know that Russia ran a giant multi-channel disinformation campaign aimed at weakening international support. They had false narratives, fake news, forged documents, tens of thousands of people of content. So if you shotgun pellet shoot that into the culture, this influencer, this podcast, these, 500 clips that are maximized by algorithms to drive outrage and more views, and you can gig the algorithms, you can take an effort and really shift it. And we shouldn't have people shouldn't be chanting foreign slogans and reiterating foreign talking points in America unless they're choosing to do so.
One of the things that struck me as miraculously insane and demented over the last few months was the fact that Iran's head, Khamenei, tweeted out his congratulations to the protesters on American campuses for supporting Hamas. And I thought the fact that that happened in and of itself was something remarkable to behold, but also the fact that it flew by under the radar, essentially. I don't see much difference between that and Hitler congratulating, the neo-Nazis in the United States in 1939 for the remarkable success recruiting in campuses. And so let's zero in Iran again, because you talked about TikTok in particular.
Well, I want to get to the Iran thing. I think that's a superb point.
Yeah.
So people here are not mirroring the voices of all the countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, right.
It's the Islamic regime. It's not Saudi, UAE, and Qatar, who, despite complications that are significant, which I'm not downplaying, are building things and having trade, even if there's resources going elsewhere.
Right. So it's not like Iran, the Iranian Islamic State is Islam or the Middle East.
Right. And it's not like it's Jordan.
The worst element.
That's right. And like Jordan, the king in Jordan has done spectacular things. Egypt, incredibly complicated relationship with Israel, but I think they know how to contend with each other. We're taking up the cry of a foreign regime that even its own people
hate. Yes, hate.
And the diaspora
incredibly oppressive.
You don't meet a lot of, Sam Harris said this to me yesterday, said, I'm not meeting a lot of confused Iranian Jews morally. It's like they're really clear. And we did a documentary we're going to show later that was like, let's talk to Muslim, Jewish, gay, let's talk to a bunch of different Iranians and talk about Iranian Americans or Iranians in the diaspora and just talk about what this playbook looks like.
Harris's economic plan,
Sorry, there's some advertisement.
Like, this is a very particular choice. And to me, that is a state that the regime, and you can like that regime if you want, but that regime has declared that what it wants is the destruction and death of America.
Right.
That's its long-term goal. And
right,
so,
it has been since 1979.
Right, it's not even, frankly, to me, that regime in particular, it's not even Russia or China.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I think it's
not that Russia and China, we don't have a lot of that we have to figure out with them. I mean, there's no question that it's problematic the ways that they're working, but it's to me, it's very puzzling because it's unequivocal that you're reiterating. And I'm not saying that this is all protesters, and I'm not saying this is all people who are taking positions for Palestine and arguing on behalf of Palestine. I'm saying that the thread of people within that are vocal and are reiterating statements from a regime that has its express long-term goal, the destruction of America, that's something that's noteworthy.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I can imagine peace with Russia. It's harder for me to imagine long-term peace with China because the Chinese are communists, and that actually turns out to be a problem. But I still think that's
But we do a lot of trade with China.
Exactly.
And China's
they're
amazing.
Quite pragmatic. But Iran is a different issue, the Islamic State there, because their stated goal is enmity. There's no desire whatsoever for peace. They're after a kind of total and genocidal victory, and they're declared enemies of the United States and have been forever.
That's insanity. Yes, and then they're paying what? They're paying for people's opinions to be more positive towards themselves so they can continue.
They're the ones saying it.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's not like we're inventing this and labeling them as such. This is by their own definition. And by the way, the long-term relationship with Iran, I think, is at some point, I think is going to be incredible. The Iranian people are amazing.
Mm-hmm. Right, an educated population that was headed in the right direction until the 1979 revolution. which has
Yeah.
been quite the ongoing catastrophe. Right. And so, okay, so how do you see the practically speaking, how do you see the trail of causality, let's say, between the Iranian manipulators behind the scene, TikTok, American young women, and let's say the campus protests that have been going on forever since, well, everywhere since October 7th?
It's important to acknowledge that America isn't a hapless victim in this. Like, we have not done a good job minding our institutions from capture and corruption, institutions from the left to the right. So we have plenty to do with this. I'm not suggesting that we're just sort of hapless victims in all this. If we had stayed on top of, look, what we allow with kids with the internet is so insane. I mean, imagine if you're 12 years old and your parents were like, you're gonna go to school, but you're gonna have in your pocket unlimited porn, access to the world's greatest terrorists who can talk to you in person.
And the world's greatest criminals.
Right, and it's designed to shorten your attention span. And it's in your pocket, it's in your desk, it's in your locker, it's in the bathroom at school, and we can't do anything about it because free speech.
Mm-hmm.
That's an asinine position. And there's people like Jonathan Haidt, who clearly is brilliantly delineated where and how we can have the...
I agree entirely. It's a way to destroy the population. And that's obvious, right? Like, that's a big problem. Big problem in modern society. Huge, gigantic problem.
This be one tool of communication. Everything's not a free speech issue. This isn't the Nazis marching during Skokie, where the ACLU, back when the ACLU was rigorously for free speech, defended their right to march. That's not this moment. This is kids who don't have developed brains yet, and we're blasting them with all sorts of information, and
Yep.
we have allowed that. We've left
Agreed.
the door open, and I think that a lot of Americans are ready to start to figure out how we can close that door through reasonable dialogue, if we can find it through, like, the rage industrial complex.
Yeah,
But they're ready now.
Well, there's a massive technical problem here too, which is that the institutions necessary to allow for effective communication to take place, which is what protections for free speech ensure, haven't kept pace with the technological transformation. And the problem with communal existence in general, including communal communication, is the potential for capture of the communication strategies by truly bad actors, by the sadistic, Machiavellian, psychopathic, narcissistic types, and then
who now have teams of addiction specialists and AI deep machine learning at their disposal, which means every time a kid is scrolling through X and their eye snags, they're reading what things are drawing his attention.
Yeah.
Their brains are being hacked. I don't think you can actually be on certain kinds of rage social media and be sane while you're on it. I don't think it's you that's having your thoughts. And we're letting this go to kids.
I'm inclined to agree.
Unmitigated.
Do you think that's particularly true of TikTok?
TikTok, Twitter. I mean, look, it depends where. You can go down a podcast rabbit hole. You can go down it on YouTube. I don't think it's fair to call out the platform. It's really like our willingness to have the platform.
TikTok capitalizes on much shorter form content.
Yeah,
though, and so there's going to be.
X2.
Yeah. So I think there is a relationship.
But maybe it's onboarding to go deeper into YouTube and because that's
fair enough. But there's probably something pathological. There's a pathological inclination that's built into social media platforms that capitalize on short-term attention, right?
Yes, and shortening it.
Yeah.
So they have the control. We're turning over. One way to think of it is we're turning over generational control of our children's psychological, emotional, and physical development and nervous systems to hackers in big corporations and foreign governments.
That's, wow, a very succinct and scary way of putting it, but accurate. Because if you control the children, then you control the population, right?
Like, we don't need to do that. There's very clear parameters. We can have different ways that we figure stuff out. We can design different kinds of phones. It's not perfect, but to throw up our hands and act as if it's totally unreasonable that we want to build a healthy generation of kids and that we don't want polarization and people who hate America as their clearly stated aim to be hijacking
especially
our country.
manipulated polarization.
Right, especially when the majority of Americans don't want this. It's not like you're the majority saying, let's have it. And we'll get to that.
Yep.
Let's take a quick skip through a couple things we looked at.
Yep.
So anti-Semitism, it seems, is sort of exploding. This is a stat from the ADL. Again, with any news source, there's complications and issues. The FBI just released a report showing that hate crimes are exploding against Jews. And it's pretty well received. So let's say that these stats are going to be...
Lay out the numbers for the listeners, approximately.
Well, 2023, we have 8,873 defined incidents of anti-Semitism, up from 912 in 2014.
Right, and it's pretty flat from 2014 to...
So what happened in 2023? We know also that within hours of the attack on October 7th, that the information and bots were primed to go into America to start switching that from
How do you
China
know
around.
that?
It's been tracked. People looking at the content saw the content that was sort of lined up and ready to go. Look, it wasn't, even if it wasn't, like, let's say we're not explaining it by clean conspiracy, that phone calls went on between Russia, Iran, and China, and they all planned and spun up factories. But this is just ongoing and material that they already have and are doing. And so it found much more fertile ground. The conversation flared up around it. You infuse more bots into
That's very psychopathic.
a volcanic eruption, and off it goes. So the conspiracy doesn't have to be a Bond villain, but this is the way that it moves. Domestic psychopaths are, and we can talk about the dark tetrad later, because I've heard you're a psychologist, so maybe you can lay out that
some
part.
people think so.
You know, and so that's that. But the thing is that's really, so here's this kind of Venn diagram of the ways that Russia, China, and Iran are messing with us. Iran is the Democrats' blind spot. Russia is the Republicans' blind spot, for the most part. That's their most fertile ground. But again, they're not partisan. They want chaos. You know, they want to fund, you know, pro-gay rights, anti-gay rights. They did that in Russia to distract, right? I mean, so they what they want is chaos and our distraction to be elsewhere, and all of our money and resources going to partisan, you know, organization, like just moving getting all of our rage focused on one outcome. Because if you get angry enough and polarized enough, then no matter what happens, the other side's an existential threat and all other values fall away. How about housing? How about insurance? It's like existential threat. And so that's what they've been driving towards, is this polarization where we hate each other, which is totally new. I mean, you remember McCain taking the microphone away from the woman when she said she was, you know, terrified that about Obama, and like we have such a tradition that regardless of what happens, we try to bring forth the best, however imperfectly and corruptly, of the parties, and at least have a surface narrative of wanting what's best for the country, because the narrative trickles down into reality as best it can.
That points to the necessity of an of an overarching union of identity rather than the fractionation of the identity.
But if we're not even pretending, let's say people said, oh, it was all pretending. It's like, it wasn't all pretending. The 1990s, like, we had a lot of things
clearly
close.
Not all pretending.
I have a friend who's very interesting, conservative, you know, lives in Texas, the whole thing. And he said to me, and we can get to this part later, he said, what's so amazing is he's from a much more rigorously conservative background. But he said, we were almost there. I remember my kids coming home and they'd have a friend come over who was black and a friend come over who was gay, and everyone behaved, and they wouldn't even think to sort of mention it because everything was sort of clear. Like, we were in this place.
We had that in Toronto.
It was
clearly,
like,
when my kids grew up, it was completely irrelevant.
It was like an idol, and we had it. And the answer is continuing progression and movement towards division of groups rather than acceptance of groups that point up towards the shared identity. I mean, that's one of the things with, this is something that's worth getting to.
Yeah,
and we can turn to that. So here's the thing that's also interesting. America isn't really, aside from obviously explosive things that we're seeing on the fringes, which are scary and I think terrifying and wholly unacceptable under American values. But aside from that, America isn't actually real America, broad America, not captured America, anti-Semitic. 92% of Americans thought the October 7th attack was unjustified. 92%. 73% believe it's important to maintain the U.S.-Israeli alliance. whatever you think of that, 73% is a lot. Terrorist attacks, here's a question we asked, like 9/11 in America and October 7th in Israel should not be tolerated, and those countries have a right to defend themselves. 92% of people support that, right? And then different people, like we polled out that, the plurality, 46% believe protests on college campuses are deeply troubling, while a third, 31%, believe college students are always going to protest something. So you add those up and you're at what, 77% of people who are like not on board or understanding that. I mean, these are really significant. However, if you get a good foothold, like when Russia was allowed to paint Stars of David on synagogues and people's houses, or when they sent operatives to do that, there's purchase, there's a foothold, but there is for a lot of things. Jews aren't the only existential issue in America.
How did you choose which internet service provider to use?
Some insanity here.
See, on the philosophical side, the hallmark of postmodernism is disbelief, is skepticism regarding uniting meta-narratives, right? That's the core definition of postmodernism, is skepticism of uniting meta-narratives, and this insistence that true identity has to devolve down the value hierarchy to something approximating group identity, and then that morphs very easily into a victim-victimizer narrative. And so you can see that this polarization is also being produced by the ascendancy of postmodernism as a intellectual exercise in the universities. And your polling and work indicates that the center does hold, and that it's much more solid than people believe, and that to the degree that we accept that postmodern doctrine that there is no such thing as a shared identity in the UK, because the UK people in the UK are debating that now. There's no such thing as a Canadian identity. Our own bloody Prime Minister in Canada has said exactly that the American identity, the American project, is nothing but racist and oppressive. That demolishes that transcendent narrative that actually constitutes social unity, and it facilitates movement towards identity that's based on more fractionated elements of race or sex or ethnicity or intelligence or wealth, whatever it happens to be. There's a million different ways to divide people, and that starts to, it looks to me like that starts to inevitably produce something like a victim-victimizer narrative, and then that expresses itself, for example, in particularly toxic forms of anti-Semitism, sort of as the canary in the coal mine. It looks to me like the causal pathway.
And one of the things that you've noted, and we've talked.
Crazy. Yeah, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Some worrying stuff going on in the West in 2024. All right. Again, you can buy my books at bit.ly/heliosbooks. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all for notifications. You want me to teach you how to get good at getting girls? Well, there's my email, theheliosblog@gmail.com. Just email me, and I'll slot you right into my coaching services. Thank you so much for listening, guys, especially if you listen to the end. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.